thank you all for joining today. It's great to see so many people on the call, joining from all around the world. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kashaf Momin, and I will be moderating today's Fields of the Future speaker series, exploring urban climate innovation. To share a little bit about me, I work at Hilton, the global hospitality company, in its procurement department. And my role is focused on ensuring that all of the goods and services that a hotel needs, ranging from food to furniture to bath amenities, are purchased responsibly, ethically, and sustainably. Before working in corporate sustainability, I was working in the nonprofit sector, focusing on issues at the intersection of human health and the environment, notably air pollution and toxic chemicals. A little bit about this series. The Fields of the Future speaker series is a collaboration between many Jamaati institutions in the US and Canada, including Aga Khan Education Board, the Climate Change Portfolio, and the Ismaili Professionals Network. We hope that this series is helpful to you as you explore career paths and opportunities in these fields of the future. So now, without further ado, I'm very pleased and excited to introduce you to our speaker for today, Sonam Velani. Sonam is passionate about cities and the infrastructure and technology that drives them forward. From New York to Barcelona to Mumbai, she has collaborated with businesses and governments to deploy multi-billion-dollar investments in climate-smart infrastructure. With experience at Goldman Sachs, the World Bank, the New York City Mayor's Office, and Zipline, she is skilled at structuring financial transactions, operating large-scale projects, and leading public-private partnerships. Sonam is now launching Streetlife Ventures, a venture firm and catalytic capital vehicle that invests in the nuts and bolts of sustainable cities. Sonam's interest in urban development is rooted in her lived experience. An undocumented immigrant for 2 decades, she understood how inadequate housing, transportation, and environmental protections limit upward mobility. The first in her family to graduate college, Sonam received a full scholarship to Harvard University and earned a BA in government, economics, and visual and environmental studies. She loves being active in her community and volunteers with the Girl Scouts, the Women's Impact Alliance, Climate Tech Cities, Empower, and the Aga Khan Development Network. In her free time, Sonam enjoys city biking, museum hopping, watching reruns of The West Wing, and getting lost in new cities and new conversations. And now, without further ado, Sonam will speak to us about urban climate innovation, her career path, and how this field will evolve in the future. All right, Sonam, the mic is yours.
Great, thanks. And great to see everyone. Hi, I'm Sonam Velani, dialing in from New York City. This is our beautiful New York City harbor and Governor's Island, which is a brand new climate innovation center here in New York. So I am excited to dive in. First, I thought I would spend a bit of time talking a bit about my own journey, and hopefully that serves as, both inspiration for you all, and, we'll dive into a lot of these topics as we carry on. So I was born in Bombay, grew up in Chicago, and have lived around the world since then. I've worked across the public and private sectors, from infrastructure finance at Goldman Sachs to working across Asia while at the World Bank, building infrastructure that doesn't fall apart during earthquakes or hurricanes or other natural disasters, and actually using data in those planning purposes. I helped design New York City's climate plan, so it's about $15 billion of investments and 10 different legislative actions to get our city to net zero by 2050. And I've worked at startups like Zipline, which uses fully autonomous electric drones for last mile delivery, particularly life-saving medicines in cities across Africa. Throughout all this, I have focused on building community to connect the dots between cities, climate, and capital. I'm now the co-founder and managing partner of Streetlife. We are a venture fund that invests at the intersection of cities and climate. So anything from, porous concrete to point source carbon capture solutions for buildings to carbon capture technologies and recycled asphalt for our streets. Basically anything related to the built environment and urban infrastructure. So that's what I'm happy to talk to you all about today. And please, come ask lots and lots of questions as we go through this. So as you can probably tell, I am fascinated by the history of cities. I used to work um, down the street from the site of the Pearl Street station down in Lower Manhattan, and that's where Thomas Edison built the country's first power station and illuminated Wall Street. This happened at the same time as the steel mills of Detroit and the Ford manufacturing plants, and countless other innovations across the world that really still play a vital role in our lives today. And this was the age of the industrial revolution, right? It's when the workforce was on the ground, it was building our cities, it was building the infrastructure that connects our cities. And really industrialization and urbanization went hand in hand. And high wages and benefits fueled investments in housing and urban development and thriving local economies. Unfortunately, since the 1950s, we've been stuck in a bit of a rut, particularly here in the US. Much of our manufacturing and production capabilities have moved, and it can often feel impossible to actually build anything, whether it's homes or transit or new infrastructure. And I've spent my career in this, so I can tell you how difficult all of that is. But deindustrialization, often decimated once thriving industrial neighborhoods and made it difficult for us to deploy new technologies that can actually improve our lives. And in the era of climate change, I'd argue that this has meant that we often can't put technologies to work where we need them most. But the last few years, luckily, things have started to change. And the reason for that is that climate change has sort of created this local awakening, right? We've got orange skies. There were orange skies outside of my window here in New York City a few weeks ago. We've got flooded streets and neighborhoods across the places we call home, right? And at Streetlife, we're really excited about this awakening, and we call it the age of climate industrialism. And it's really our very optimistic and action-oriented response to climate doom and gloom, and sort of this rejection of the idea that climate solutions have to be rooted in scarcity or sacrifice. But instead, it's a bet that climate solutions that are rooted in abundance and progress will actually create value for people, both in their daily lives and across all of our cities. So I'll start with the basics here. Climate action can basically be broken down into two different buckets. The first is mitigation, and the second is adaptation and resilience. We funneled about 93% of our climate resources to date on mitigation, which basically means reducing the amount of GHG emissions in our atmosphere. Climate change is here now. I can guarantee almost every single one of you has experienced that in front of your own streets. And it's going to make things a lot worse before mitigation can make them better. So we absolutely have to invest in adaptation. And at Streetlife, we're really focused on solutions in the middle. So those that really impact both sides of the equation. This can be anything from hydroponic gardens on roofs that insulate buildings and collect water and grow food, increase in property values. Companies like Shaduf in Cairo and Green Savers in Dhaka in Bangladesh are weaving these rooftop gardens into crowded cityscapes in two of the largest cities in the world. We've also got shade structures, things that use trees and vines and solar panels to provide cooling and generate energy and make places much more beautiful. Companies like Lumirev in Tel Aviv in Israel are providing shade during the day and serving as solar-powered installations at night. And we have cool corridors. In Canada, companies like Gramineer and Evergreen are actually developing geospatial analytics and artificial intelligence and data visualization tools to map these changes in the urban heat island effect. So think about it this way, right? In your own home, if you're thinking about solving for heat, and it's 90 degrees outside of my outside here in New York, I'm turning on the air conditioner, and you're looking at sort of column A, right, where I'm just solving for heat. That puts a huge strain on my energy consumption. It drives up my bills. It increases CO2 emissions. But when you're thinking about solving for co-benefits, right, things that will both make me comfortable and actually improve the planet, you can implement solutions like passive house designs, which keep our indoor temperatures cool. and use things like green roofs and efficient heat pumps and air conditioners by companies like Gradient or Blue Frontier, which actually reduce electricity usage by about 90%. And this list can go on and on, right? There are tons of examples where today's climate innovation is rooted in software knowledge work, which is absolutely critical. But the reality is that, vulnerability assessments and strategic plans and resource optimization won't actually solve climate change unless we act on that information in the real world. And I can tell you that because I've written many a PDF report over the years. And we really need sort of real technologies in our ground, right? Products of tomorrow's climate industries that are doing their thing in our streets to actually make a difference. We all want cities to be more beautiful and livable, and by focusing on these co-benefits, we're really excited to think about new funding streams and widespread adoption for anything from building materials to new water systems to home retrofits and transportation technologies that you see here today. So why do we focus on cities? Cities are the labs where we test and develop solutions, right? We're seeing cities embrace their role in promoting the development, the manufacturing, and the uptake of climate technologies around the world. And trust me, it's not just a branding exercise. We're seeing these technologies from manufacturing and sort of production all the way to implementation. And this is really critical to our thesis on climate industrialism, right? It's to act as urban labs for climate solutions where cities are both taking policy action as well as budgetary action. And now I'll sort of go through and how this is actually being implemented across the globe. So I was very lucky to go to Alaska a few months ago, and I, really thought, it doesn't really get more front lines than this. You're on these helicopters, and these glaciers are melting faster than anywhere else in the world. And there are national, Park Service signposts that are very visceral, in-your-face reminders of the rate of climate change. Native villages along coastlines are being forced into inland areas, often fleeing the rising seas. And these impacts are so severe that climate activists have actually started suing the state. And the reason for that is that Alaska is basically oil country, right? The state doesn't actually have any income tax, any sales tax, any property taxes, and oil and gas accounts for the vast majority of the state's revenues. So of course, oil is driving GHG emissions and all of these sort of negative consequences to Alaska's sort of natural heritage, but it's also paying for schools and hospitals and infrastructure, right? Because that's where the budget comes from. And oil and gas production has seen a decline in Alaska since the 80s, and the state's revenue has plummeted, particularly with the fall of global oil prices a few years ago. But as renewable energy generation and transmission really takes off, that trend, we could continue to see that in the long run. And this is really this catch-22 in Alaska, right? It's the fact that Alaska as a state really needs to think about how it's going to transition away from oil and gas and build a much more diversified economy. So by embracing climate industrialism now, not when all the glaciers have melted, Alaska can really transition the economy to capitalize on natural assets besides oil and gas. And its unique location and physical geography and coastlines, its biodiversity and indigenous knowledge, like no other. Here's an image of in Kodiak, Alaska, and there's an aerospace innovation hub at this location called Merrill Field. And whether it's your cell phone connectivity or your Google Earth images or remote sensing, it all comes from these new low Earth orbiting satellites that are launched in much lower polar altitudes, over the North Pole, over the South Pole, and back, right? And this hub here is actually partnering with the U.S. Naval Research Center and positioning Anchorage to actually take advantage of this new growth in commercial spaceports, right? So new satellites are going to be instrumental in actually not only shifting Alaska's economy, but actually using the information that's collected through these instruments to monitor global GHG emissions. Other examples are of Alaska's very strategic location, rooted in its economic history and its logistics. Anchorage is actually the world's fourth largest cargo port. It's about 10 hours by flight to 90% of the industrialized world. This means that Maritime Port has over $14 billion of economic activity over the course of 1 year. And it's really thinking about here at Sandia National Laboratories, how can we actually work with the Port of Alaska, develop MOUs, develop renewable energies for the port, and create microgrids and independent power systems that can help enhance climate resilience, and really do that with the advent of new technologies. This here is a photo of beaded steam, which actually designs and manufactures temperature monitoring solutions for industrial applications. So they're actually monitoring the temperature of sea ice and how that can actually impact infrastructure such as ships and ports and bridges and offshore structures all along the Alaskan coast. And this is a sort of a prime example of how a state like Alaska is actually thinking about diversifying its economy away from those oil resources. Next here is in Tempe, Arizona. It's a development called Cul-de-sac. And really what they thought about is how do you build a neighborhood from the ground up? And particularly if you had to make it withstand some of the hottest temperatures in America in annual monsoons. This is in Cul-de-sac. This development is Cul-de-sac and it's in Phoenix. Tempe is a suburb right outside of Phoenix. And it is the fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States. And they focus significantly on beauty and livability in such an extreme environment. And that's led the team to develop and design a lot of new climate technologies and design solutions that many other developers in the real estate industry are really hard pressed to beat. Some of these include things like co-benefit scorecards, right? Where you're thinking about what are the heat resilience features like permeable grounds or the design and layout of my development, my real estate development? What are the colors that I'm using on the building facades and on our roofs? And they've got an entire sort of scorecard for solar reflectance heat index of different colors. And as you can see here, lighter colors reflect a lot more heat, right? And that means that the more lighter surfaces you have, the cooler your ground temperatures are, especially in a place like Phoenix, which has seen about a 90-day streak of temperatures over 100 degrees this summer. It's thinking about the design of your hallways and your physical layout of your buildings to have airflow going across your building structure rather than punctuated by hallways, right? Again, all of these are design principles. And here's an example of a photo from the construction site from a few months ago of this 1,000 unit development. I'm actually very happy to say that they have just launched. So folks are actually moving in as we speak. Next, I've got an example from Minneapolis in Minnesota. And the Green Minneapolis team is doing something extremely creative to facilitate the funding and development of street trees. When you have trees in your neighborhoods, particularly in the summertime, they serve as locations that can collect water during rainstorms, and they can cool the urban sort of sidewalk temperature upwards of almost up to 5 degrees Celsius, right? Which is pretty significant on a hot summer day. And what Green Minneapolis does is that it's this virtual cycle of urban tree planting, right? And it's this partnership between Green Minneapolis and the city's Parks Department, where revenue is generated from the carbon credits that are sold, and that money is then used to finance more tree planting and maintenance by the Minneapolis Parks Department. And this not only supports the maintenance of already planted trees, but also finances the planting of more trees, which produces more credits and then generates more funds to plant even more trees, right? So you've got this really great circle of life to a certain extent, right? And last November, Green Minneapolis actually announced the state's first urban tree carbon offset project in partnership with City Forest Credits, which is this nonprofit organization that facilitate sort of the financial transactions around this, right? And CFC actually calculates how much carbon those trees will capture, and they assume that the trees will live for about 25 years. And then Green Minneapolis uses those carbon credits and sells them to local businesses. Minneapolis is home to large companies like Target, for example, who are buying these credits to fulfill their own net zero commitments. So, this is really thinking about the fact that trees will not be able to be cut down by developers. These are things that are very easily measurable because they're literally in front of your streets. And it's really thinking about how can you actually create a system where you're not only planting trees, but you're also improving air quality, you're reducing energy costs, you're collecting rainwater, right? You have all of these co-benefits in place. And this is an example of one of the major sort of urban parks in downtown Minneapolis that's really built on this sort of circular trust relationship, right, between all of these different actors across the public and private sector. Next, I've got Austin, Texas, and this is where infrastructure and climate solutions sort of have to work in the same way, right? When everything is functioning perfectly, it's easy to take for granted things like technologies and other things that make life better for people. But it's often when things go wrong that, you see these issues in the headlines, right? Nobody cares about infrastructure, and then your power doesn't work, right? And everybody's outraged. And Austin is a really great example of this phenomenon, right? So Austin has gained, unfortunately, notoriety recently for its winter freezes, right? About a year ago, we had about 171,000 people who had lost power, and temperatures dipped down to about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the summertime, Austin is extremely hot, right? More than a third of the year, temperatures are above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's only increasing. So to keep things simple, Austin has implemented this district cooling solution where they are actually thinking about using district cooling as indoor air conditioning for an entire neighborhood or for a network of buildings, from apartment buildings to hospitals and libraries. And district cooling systems can actually use a variety of different technologies. These depend on what's suited best for the region and for the city that they're built in, but they all more or less work the same way. This is a showcase of sort of Austin's example, right? And it's run by a group called Austin Energy, which has 7 different facilities. And it's actually located right downtown if you're ever in the area. And it's a short 3-story building that takes up very little space, and it has the capacity to cool down the equivalent of about 1,500 homes. And it does so twice as efficiently as traditional air conditioners. And the way it works is that this particular plant that you see on your screen uses evaporation to cool water, and it's a 2-loop system. So one closed loop and one open loop. And together, these loops draw out heat out of the buildings, then move that heat back into this central facility, this district cooling facility, in the form of warm water. And then at that facility, the heat is evaporated off, and then voila, right? There's sort of this efficient large-scale cooling, which is, again, a much larger version of how your air conditioner works at home. And this sort of shows the size of the facility, and Anson is one of our fellows who, we tried to show how large something like this can be, but really how efficient it is. More efficient cooling doesn't just mean less carbon emissions, which is great for the planet, right? But it also means lower costs for individual homeowners when it comes to things like paying the bills, and thinking about how much money they're spending on the thermostat, or preventing power outages, right? This storage tank really is a very good example of that, because load shifting is an energy management technique where energy usage is shifted from peak demand hours to off-peak demand hours, right? And district cooling does this by basically cooling water in this giant storage tank during off-peak hours, and then storing it so that it's ready to use, right? So that when people turn on their thermostats and they're looking for, how to sort of keep themselves cool, they can draw down on this cold water. And this really works in dense urban areas, right? Because it doesn't take a lot of space, and it makes a lot of sense to use these systems for large buildings like multifamily housing or tall condo buildings or other such sort of high density environments rather than single family homes, right? Places where you can build up. And it's really great for new neighborhoods because these new developments have the capacity to actually incorporate a lot of this infrastructure, right, in these closed loop systems as they're under construction. So it's really about thinking of, how can cities roll out the red carpet for climate industrialism and not the red tape? The mayor of Pittsburgh, Bill Peduto, actually, coined this phrase about rolling out the red carpet rather than the red tape when he was talking about sort of how can cities actually function to actually work with the technology sector, right? And focus on dynamism rather than statism, right? And dynamism basically means allowing technology solutions to experiment, thinking about advanced purchase commitments, right? Cities have huge budgets. The city of New York, for example, has $100 billion budget every single year. We spend a lot of money, right? How can we use our procurement power to actually buy the new gradient heat pumps for our public housing facilities and be that market mover? It means strong and effective partnerships between startups and industry. It means simplifying permitting and zoning processes, right? So that these solutions can get into the ground much faster than at the current rate. So now I'm going to sort of bring this out to the bigger picture, right? And thinking about how can you actually participate in this? And I often say, climate is not just one sector of the economy. It's a full transformation of the economy. It's a full transformation of how we live, how we work, how we play. This can mean anything from energy systems, so things like offshore wind or battery storage or demand response, buildings, your own HVAC systems at your home, your own Nest solutions, your own energy management systems, the construction materials that you're using to build your homes. It means transportation, right? And the individual choices that you make when you decide not to buy a car and instead use public transit and bicycles and scooters. I myself do not have a driver's license. Right? I am extremely conscious of that because I live in a city where I have a plethora of options that frankly will get me, to my destination much faster than me sitting in a car, right? And thinking about where you live and what types of decisions that you make on an individual basis as you're thinking about your own climate impacts. It means circular economy, right? How you're thinking about your recycling, your composting. What types of products and services are you actually purchasing? What are you doing to show demand to large corporates that if something comes on the market, if something comes on the shelves, there will be a market for these, for these new products. It's our food systems. Simple things like how much beef you're eating every day, right? Which is an extremely energy ineffective food source. And where you're getting your food from, right? Whether it's through local sort of farmers markets or if it's being trucked across the country from California to New York, right? Which is what often happens in our food systems. It's thinking about adaptation and resilience, the data and the visualization tools that you could be developing to understand that climate risk in your streets and neighborhoods, as well as the physical sort of infrastructure you need, things like porous concrete, right? Such that when it rains, the water has someplace to go and doesn't end up in your basement. It means finance, right? The analytics tools, the financing tools, the insurance tools, the investing tools, where you put your own dollars to work, right? What are the types of companies you are investing in and how you can make a difference. It means media and television, right? I live in New York City. There's all sorts of movie shootings and screenings happening outside my door, right? And how you're thinking about how all of this is ultimately presented in our day-to-day. These are a couple of resources in terms of how to get smart about this industry, right? There are tons and tons of newsletters, podcasts, webinars, all sorts of things that you can do to learn more about this sector. Some of my favorites kind of cut across they cut across the sort of gamut of climate solutions that are out there. Things like the Zero newsletter is really focused on carbon emissions and really thinking about how these solutions are deployed in communities that are underserved, right? And thinking about social justice and inequality. Climate Tech VC is something that I read all the time, and it's actually started by two friends of mine, Sophie and Kim, who are focused on how can we actually deploy solutions, right? And use our venture capital dollars, right? Those early stage investments that firms like mine make into some of these solutions so that they can grow and they can test and they can iterate. Heated is a weekly newsletter that can be in your inbox and really showcases a lot of individual solutions day to day. My own newsletter, Parachute, which is where a lot of this content comes from, is another example of that. Then you've got a lot of structured learning programs, right? So this is all about how can you actually get involved, work on short-term projects, and get involved in these communities, right? And learn more through these project-based initiatives. Work on Climate has an extremely active Slack community, about 20,000 people, right? And it's a great way to get involved in different learning communities, right? Whether it's around ocean sequestration technologies or regenerative agriculture or climate finance, right? How do you actually change that pie where so much of our funding goes to mitigation rather than adaptation, as I was talking about earlier. There are a number of different fellowships, whether it's climate-based or Terra.do, which is one of my personal favorites, really focused on that climate transition, right? Because again, every job is a climate job, so how can you get involved? Climate Vine is bringing together folks from the policy community, from the investment community, from the entrepreneurship community to break down those silos. And then Climate Tech Bootcamp is really focused on these early stage entrepreneurs, right? And a program that really focuses on a foundation to actually build your business in this space. There's also in-person communities, right? So all of these different groups have dinners and outings and happy hours across cities, across the world, right? I was in Singapore a few months ago and got to attend a breakfast that one of my friends from Terra.do organized. And MCJ, we hosted, my own organization is called Climate Tech Cities, and we hosted an event with My Climate Journey a few months ago where we brought together a lot of folks on the early stage team, on the investment side, as well as founders. Women in Climate holds monthly dinners in a number of different cities across the world, right? So there are lots and lots of ways for you to get involved. And just to double click on that, right? This organization, Climate Tech Cities, which is an organization that I helped start, we actually started as an 8-person dinner in New York City, this was mid-COVID, right? Outdoor, masked, the whole thing. We are now a community of about 5,000 people in New York and almost 10,000 people across the world, right? And again, it only takes one dinner to get started, right? And we host webinars, we host happy hours, we host co-working events, we host panel sessions in different cities where we operate. And it's really to sort of transition a lot of that learning that you might do on an individual basis or through these online communities, and then come together in real life and actually engage with folks across the ecosystem. So again, you can sign up for any of these and really try to get involved. And you might be thinking, oh, what can I do today? And there's so much that you can do just from some of these examples that I showcased in terms of how you can get involved in your city and really make the most of some of the opportunities in this space. So I will leave you with that. Feel free to get in touch. I am, for better or for worse, I'm the only one on the internet with my name. So I'm very, you can easily find me. And I'm happy to answer any questions and get into this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sonam, for sharing this field of the future with us today. I learned a lot and I'm feeling very hopeful after that presentation. I'm sure that the people on this call will really enjoyed hearing about all the different ways they can get involved in addressing climate change and climate issues in their communities. So Sonam, going back to how this has made me feel really, really hopeful. A lot of the conversation in my sector and in my space when we're talking about circularity is a conversation around how we need to reduce consumption, whether that's energy consumption, resource consumption, etc. So there's this narrative around how we need to do less, and this concept of degrowth, and how does that play into what you were speaking to earlier when you presented the definition of urban climate innovation, and you mentioned the word abundance. So that's sort of at odds with what I hear, which is that we need to reduce consumption and do less. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reality of all of this is the fact that, we are living in a time where we are surrounded by goods and services, right? I walk out of my door, there are literally 20 shops that I can walk to within 5 minutes, right? And buy basically anything that I ever need. And I don't think that that's going to change, nor should it change, right? There is this focus in climate sometimes on how can we reduce our consumption, which, yes, absolutely, that is the case, right? Do you need that extra pair of shoes? Probably not. Do you need the extra t-shirt? Probably not. But on sort of thinking about what impact that has on the global environment, right? And countries that are just coming into sort of developed status, right? And have newfound sort of middle income trajectories. A lot of money has been created through manufacturing, through investments, right? Through people really working hard. Are you going to deny them that new air conditioner or that new t-shirt or those new shoes? I think that's wrong, personally, right? And because I live in a Western society that has benefited from a lot of these sort of investments over the course of the past 200-300 years, right, and has caused a lot of this climate change issues, right? I do not think that we can, we as sort of the industrialized world can say anything to anybody else about what consumption patterns should look like, right? We are the ones at fault. So I think this focus on sort of scarcity and sacrifice is really sort of backwards, right? And we live in an age of technology and solutions, right? So we always think about what are the innovations that we can actually implement so that you're not necessarily reducing consumption, but you're thinking about the new materials and the new types of technologies that people can purchase to improve their own lives, right? And it goes back to some of the examples that I gave earlier, right? A company like Blue Frontier is creating new types of air conditioners that reduce hydrofluorocarbons, right? And reduce emissions up to 90%, right? There are technologies where you're using mushrooms to actually create packaging for instead of plastic packaging, right? Using sort of this biodegradable packaging. There are waste to energy systems that are being created that are taking my wastewater, right, and the sort of sludge of our cities and turning that into energy, right? And not only is that great for society, it creates a lot of very, very high quality jobs. It creates sort of this abundance and progress, right, and economic growth that is required to sustain all of our communities, even in the age of climate change. So I think we've really got to change our perceptions on what we're asking people to do, right? And climate solutions should be about progress, right? They should be about abundance. They should be about the fact that I'm buying a Tesla because it's a good car, right? Not because it is good for the planet, or not only because it's good for the planet. So I just think that the conversation needs to shift a lot.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And I think what you said about, making the distinction that we can't ask people in emerging economies, we can't ask emerging economies to do these things because it's these advanced economies like the US that are more at fault, and maybe the conversation around reduction of consumption is more for those economies that have sort of overshot rather than emerging economies. So yes, I recognize that point. And there's actually an audience question sort of around this sort of distinction between developing economies, emerging economies, and advanced economies. So do you have examples of these innovative solutions in the developing world where expensive technologies and budgets may not be available. What have you seen outside of the United States and just in other areas where the resources and in terms of tech and money is maybe not there?
Yeah, I don't think that it's not there. I think there's innovation that happens everywhere in the world, right? It's just the fact that the financing needs to move towards those innovations, right? There are smart people developing all sorts of cool stuff all across the globe. Trust me, I get tons and tons of pitches basically every day, right, from people, right? But it's about thinking about the financing structures that enable the growth of those solutions in some of these economies, and that's where the challenge is. Just for some context, right? The world has emitted about 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 since 1751, right? Which is sort of when records were started being kept, right? And the United States accounts for about 25% of that. The EU accounts for about 22% of that. China accounts for about 13% of that. A place like Pakistan, which last summer, 1/3 of the entire country was underwater in a matter of days, right? And many of the folks on this call might have lived through that. Pakistan accounts for 0.01% of the world's cumulative carbon emissions, right? So these are the economies that are really bearing the brunt of these challenges. And that's why when I come back to that climate adaptation versus mitigation pie, adaptation only gets 7% of all climate finance dollars today, right? But these are challenges that these countries are facing today. And not, they're just going to get worse by 2050 by the time we actually scale some of the mitigation technologies. So I often think about what are the types of solutions that some of these economies can implement today, right? And have those co-benefits. I often think about nature-based solutions as a part of that. And last year, luckily, the Minister of Environment of Pakistan, this woman named Sherry Rahman, who I sort of consider a personal hero of mine, convinced the global sort of powers that be at COP, which is a big climate conference every year, to actually invest in nature-based solutions and create this loss and damage fund to help countries across the global south address some of these challenges. So some of these examples, across the world are in Mozambique in a city called Beira. A few years ago, there was a cyclone called Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, that pretty much like wiped out the city, right? Or the sort of downtown of the city. And what the city's mayor did was like really flip the script, right? So they're using these state-of-the-art storm sensors to actually track water flows in real time. The government has built a new 50-acre sort of multifunctional park in the middle of the city to reduce urban flooding. And it really acts as this green sponge, right? Holding water back from the rest of the city. That entire area has been turned into a botanical garden and a community theater and local markets and sort of pedestrian and bike-friendly routes, right? And it's this combination of local initiative by the mayor coming together with large financing organizations like the World Bank to bring that financial capital so that some of these communities can actually implement these solutions. On the private sector side, there's a company called Sanergy in Nairobi in Kenya. In Nairobi, about half of the sort of almost 1 billion tons of solid waste that's generated every year is organic waste. And all that ends up in landfill and releases a huge amount of methane into the atmosphere. And the city is really under pressure to actually create these effective waste management solutions. And what Sanergy does is that it's this circular economy startup that basically converts trash to treasure, quite literally, right? It uses a natural solution for waste conversion, and there's these things called black soldier fly larvae, which is basically like small flies, and they actually consume organic waste, and then the fly poops these two byproducts, right? One is this extremely protein-rich organic fertilizer, and the other is a biomass. And Sanergy is really scaling a lot of this technology to expand across Africa to help with these waste-free solution, or sort of the circular economy solution. In Sri Lanka, wetlands reduce flood risk, as we talked about, right? And again, there's an area in Colombo called the Betaganda wetlands, right sort of on the coastal area of the capital city. But that wetland has actually decreased by about 40% because of just such high development, right, in this capital city, right? Lots of new buildings, lots of new shopping malls, or all sorts of things. And there are students at the local university which basically like created a lab and analyzed all these soil samples from the wetlands to measure their organic carbon content. And they have been able to verify this carbon content and actually, similar to the Minneapolis example that I gave, actually join this carbon offsets program, right? And they're able to, by conserving the wetlands that remain, and adding more wetlands in the area, they're able to sell these offsets and again use that money to finance this program, right, in a much more sustainable manner. And so many of these examples are all over the world, right? So I think it's not about the fact that there isn't innovation happening, it's about the fact that the money and the climate justice community and the political community actually need to come together, right, to facilitate the deployment of these solutions.
Gotcha. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And you talked about financing, and to me, or maybe to the audience listening, they're wondering, how can then we get involved if it's not an issue of innovation and the innovation is out there, and it's more of an issue around political will and getting local leaders, community leaders, political leaders, interested in promoting these solutions and scaling these solutions up. What is the role of the audience here for that?
Vote in your local elections because rubber hits the road at the local level, and I cannot emphasize that enough. I used to work for the mayor's office in New York City. I can tell you firsthand how much your vote matters and how much a phone call to someone like me matters. In our local elections, voter turnout rate is around 20%. That is abysmal, right? And you have the power to change that. Get involved in your local community board, right? There are local community meetings, I guarantee you, in your city every single night of the week, whether it's on adding new protected bike lanes on your street, getting rid of parking such that those bike lanes can be added, bringing your restaurants to outdoor cafes, pedestrianizing your streets, planting new trees, investing in pools or sort of local infrastructure, right?
I want to shift a little bit to talking about career paths. So there's a couple questions around how can someone who is just not in this industry, how can someone pivot into this industry? And have you interacted with people who have made this so-called 180 shift to another industry, focusing on climate tech, focusing on climate infrastructure? And then maybe a related question to that is, and you may have spoken and touched on this a little bit, but as you were going through your different roles, you've been in the private sector, you've worked in local government, you've worked for a startup. How did those industries and being in those different sectors get you to where you are right now talking about this with us?
Yeah, I'll start with some broad career advice that is applicable to any sector, and then I'll get into the climate discussion. And I talk to folks all the time, right, who are thinking about transitioning, whether it's into climate or into any other field, right? And I often say that you're in a job today, like, do that extremely well. Make sure you're extremely good at your job. And I can say this from personal experience where I started my career at Goldman Sachs, right? I used to be up at 2 a.m. making Excel spreadsheets on like how to finance the construction of the New York City subway or the Chicago water plant that I grew up next to, right? Or like large energy systems and sort of municipal infrastructure across the country. And trust me, nobody wants to be building, models at 2 a.m, right? But I did so with a smile on my face. And I am to this day still in touch with all of my old colleagues, whether they're still at Goldman or anywhere else. And I basically, I've never applied for a job except for that first job out of college. And I think that is testament to do something and do it really well. Prove to people around you that you're very hardworking, that you're passionate about what you do, and that you're willing to go the extra mile. Because all of those people who are your superiors will think of you when they go on and when they do their next thing. And they will think, oh, I can help, I'm trying to think of a new team member for my new initiative that I'm launching in my new company. Who should I call on? And I cannot emphasize that enough. I think when you're thinking about networking with other folks in your industry or in a new industry, tell them about what you do today, right? And what value you've created. In addition to that, keep in touch with people, right? I do all sorts of career chats. I will say that less than 5% of people that I talk to come back to me in 3 months or 6 months time, send me an email and say how they're doing, right? What they've decided, what new job they've taken on. Maybe they've decided to stay in their current role and take on new responsibilities. Less than 5% of people come back to me, right? But the 5% who do are the ones that I think of when I'm hiring or when I see a really cool job posting or a friend of mine is thinking about, oh, I'm hiring for so-and-so, do you have any recommendations, right? That relationship building is key and helps you stick out. And that is the most underestimated tool of networking that I often see and where people make mistakes. So those are two sort of broad pieces of career advice. The third is thinking about, what are the things that you can change as you're transitioning? So I often think of 3 different things. I think of your geography, your functional role, and your sector, right? And those are often sort of the 3 things that define your work. When you're thinking about transitioning, focus on changing one of those 3 things, right? So in some cases, you might want to go from being a marketing professional in the tech industry or in the beauty industry to being a marketing professional in the climate industry and still living in New York City, right? Still living in the same geography where you are. In another case, you might be thinking about, oh, I'm really good at marketing and I work at a large corporate, I work at Amazon, for example, but I want to switch and I want to go into business operations. That's another sort of transition, right? But then you keep the same sector and you keep the same geography. So, or you might be moving to a new city, right? Then you want to keep the same sector and the same functional role and look for a new location, right? All of those 3 things are intertwined and matter, but don't take on too much, right? Because by trying to change everything, you're not going to get anywhere. So that's broad career advice. In terms of switching into climate tech, right? I think the fact of the matter is that this is one, every single job is a climate job, and 2, this is a brand new sector. And it's just being developed. I'm probably one of a small handful of people I know in the industry who spent my career in this space. The vast majority of people are coming in sort of fresh, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and very few have actual experience in this sector, right? And this is where I think a lot of those structured learning programs and building a network and building a community really matters, right? And that's why I'm so passionate about things that I've started through Streetlife and with partner organizations like Climate Tech Cities, right, to help people meet folks in real life, or like Parachute, right, which is our creative research and storytelling blog about these climate solutions being implemented in different cities. Because I personally believe that you got to take solutions out of PDF reports and into the real world, and you've got to make them accessible for people, right, such that newcomers who are thinking about this space can sort of easily understand some of these different solutions. And then secondly, can meet people in person, as they're making that transition. So a lot of these jobs are new, right? And this can mean anything from, you might work at a large corporate, or you might be an industrial designer and you might be creating new products for companies like Nike or IKEA or whatever it is that you're working on. And you can say to your boss, hey, I think we should think about using different materials for this shoe that we're designing or for this bookcase that we're designing. And thinking about bringing sort of sustainability into that conversation, right? That is step 1. Step 2 is then building out a program for yourself within your own organization to, lead that effort, right? Because you came up with the idea, you might have some budget to sort of try a couple things, and then you can grow that over time, right? Step 3 is thinking about how do I take my existing skill set in industrial design and go to a climate company, right? There's no shortage of products and services that are being created in this industry, whether it's B2G, so businesses selling to government, B2B, which means business selling to business, or B2C, businesses selling to consumers. Every single one of those types of companies is looking for a skill set where they might be creating a physical product and they need your industrial design skills. So those are some ways that I would think about that transition, and the way to sort of understand some of these opportunities is to sort of get involved, right, in these place-based communities, in these fellowship programs, start educating yourself, and then take what you learn in these bite-sized pieces, right, and sort of expand it over time. You also, like, the reality is that you graduate from college when you're 22 and you're probably going to be working until you're 72. That is 50 years to do a lot of different things. So don't try to change everything all at once. But yeah, those are just some examples.
That's really helpful, and I think you put it in a really, really great way. And I agree with you. You know, you start small, and I think when it comes to climate issues, people tend to get overwhelmed and don't know where to start, but it is really just starting with educating yourself on your industry and what relevance your industry has in the climate space. Because I like to tell people sustainability is a lens through which you look through the world. So every industry, you can look at every industry through a more sustainable lens, through a more climate friendly lens. So great advice there. In terms of, we're talking about coursework and trying to build that education, and we're talking about urban climate innovation, what are some courses that you think of that would help with that? Is that urban planning? Like, what if I'm an undergraduate student trying to figure out what I can learn, are there specific classes and topics that you may want to direct someone to?
Yeah, again, literally every single thing that you will learn in school, you can apply to climate solutions, right? So I think it's a question of what you were interested in and trying to figure that out. And being in school, you know, college taught me how to think, and it taught me the things that I don't like to do, right? And my subsequent jobs taught me things that I don't like to do, right? So kind of coming back to broader career advice, try a lot of things when you're earlier in your career. Myself, right? I've worked in investment banking and infrastructure finance. I've worked in international development. I've worked in policy. I've worked at a startup, right? All of these things have taught me things that I like to do on a day-to-day basis and things that I don't like to do on a day-to-day basis, right? And that has then led me to start Streetlife, right? Which is sort of this amalgamation of learnings about myself and the content and the technical stuff that I've learned across these different jobs that I've had to actually start something that I'm super passionate about, right? And that I love to do on a day-to-day basis. So that I think is sort of the overarching theme. In terms of courses or things that really matter, particularly in the urban climate space, yeah, urban planning, city design, what your neighborhoods look like, and how those planning processes work is something that's really important. Finance is really important, right? Learn those technical skills early in your college career, early in your professional career, because those you can then apply over and over again over time. Learn the elements of software engineering or mechanical engineering or civil engineering, right? Again, those hard technical skills that can be multifunctional and can be applied to a number of different challenges within the climate space, I think is important. I'd also say, sort of technical skills, right? That you might be a little bit older in your career, right? And you might be thinking, what are things that I can do on a technical basis? What are things that I can learn at a local community college, where I don't have to spend $1 gajillion to get a degree, right? But can sort of learn vocational skills. America needs about 1 million electricians to actually decarbonize, right? And we are nowhere close to that number, right? And these are extremely high-paying jobs very, very much so in high demand, right? So these are the types of things that I often tell people to think about, right? In terms of the wide variety of things that you can learn in the scientific community, in the technical community, in the finance community, in the sort of city planning community, and then apply that, right, to different pieces of this puzzle. Because it's not like you and I are going to solve this issue alone, right? There's literally millions of people around the world who need to come together with vastly different skill sets to actually make a dent. And I cannot emphasize that enough.
Awesome. That's really great to hear. And yeah, I think you're right on. Again, any coursework can be climate coursework. Now shifting a little bit from talking about careers to talking a little bit more technically about urban climate innovation, what would you say is the difference between the built environment and urban infrastructure, if anything?
The built environment is infrastructure. 75% of the urban infrastructure of 2050 is yet to be built. And that means anything from the materials that are used on your streets to the building materials that we use to create buildings, the HVAC systems within buildings, the energy management systems within buildings, how you get rid of your trash from your home and it ends up at a recycling facility or a waste to energy facility. All of that is the built environment, right? It's the physical nuts and bolts of cities and the physicality of the things that surround you on your day-to-day basis, and it's all underlies by that physical infrastructure, right? That's why we're called Streetlife, right? Climate solutions, climate impacts and climate solutions are on your street. Whether or not your street is flooded when you walk out of the door to take your kids to school in the morning is a factor of local government and the types of investments that they and the private sector have made in the physical infrastructure around you, right? And I think those two things are intricately linked, and I often think of them as the one and the same, right? Because you've got to have that strong base layer, sort of street level and below ground infrastructure for everything above the street to actually function in a much more sustainable and resilient manner.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. I had another question more so around, if we're talking a little bit about the fact that we know everyone's going to be affected by climate change and we're feeling it today, but we also know that certain communities are going to be more susceptible to the effects of climate change. Communities of color, communities of low socioeconomic status, they're going to suffer, and they are suffering disproportionately from things like poor air quality, water pollution, heat waves. What role does this field have and these solutions have in addressing socioeconomic inequities that are making the climate impacts worse for communities that are already suffering from or that are already disadvantaged when it comes to poverty and how much money they have and their race or their cultural things that may hinder them in the economic sense.
Yeah, there is no question about the fact that challenges within underserved communities, primarily low income and minority communities, when it comes to climate, is much, much worse than a white, wealthy, rich community, in sort of the same city, right? There's absolutely no question about it. In a place like New York City, about half of the heat-related deaths in our city are amongst the sort of African American population, whereas the overall sort of breakdown is 25% of our city is African American, right? And this type of disparity is often traced back to policies like redlining, right, that have basically resulted in decades and decades of disinvestment from these communities. And they're now burdened by much older, often poorly maintained, energy inefficient housing stock, building stock, fewer street trees and green spaces, and lower wage job opportunities, right? And there's no question about it. That said, we are all about agency and optimism, right? There are lots of problems in the world. If we get stuck on the problems, we're not going to be able to move forward. So we think, okay, there are obviously challenges within these communities. How can we bring together cities, right, policymakers, climate, right, and some of these solutions oriented, and capital, right, what I work on, right, as an early stage investor? How can these three things be brought together to actually address some of the challenges in these communities, right? And that means breaking down the silos between climate tech, climate justice, and climate investment. One very good example of how this is playing out is something called the Justice 40 initiative, where the President Biden has instituted across the administration that 40% of all federal dollars through the $1 trillion infrastructure bill and the $379 billion Inflation Reduction Act, right? These are large sums of money. 40% of all those dollars are going to be focused on deploying solutions in underserved communities. So what does that mean in real life, right? It might mean that if I'm an early stage entrepreneur and I am developing some sort of EV charging mechanism, it means that I am going to use some of that Justice 40 money and actually deploy that solution in the South Bronx, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in New York City, arguably one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country, instead of Midtown Manhattan, one of the richest neighborhoods in the world, right? It means that I have some amount of cash that I can use, a non-dilutive financing, right? Grant money, that I can use to deploy these things where maybe my unit economics don't work yet, right? And I can't make the numbers work, but because I have some amount of this leeway, right, this cash, I can consciously make that decision as a business owner. As an investor, that means that the companies that I look at, right, are also representative and are founded by people who are coming from these communities. I work in venture capital. Less than 2% of all venture dollars go to women or minority-owned business owners, right? That is crazy. Less than 1% of all capital in the world is controlled by women. Firms like mine have an extremely hard time moving the needle, and there are very few of us, right? And it's up to folks like us, right, who are connected, who are who can help move the needle to sort of start these things, right, and put our money where our mouth is. So for us at Streetlife, half of our investments are dedicated to women and minority-owned businesses, right? Because we ourselves, myself and my co-founder, come from these communities, right? We have lived experiences of what it means to suffer from some of these environmental risks, and it's up to us to actually move the needle, right? And layer on our private sector dollars onto some of this government financing or some of these philanthropic dollars that can be used, that free money that can be used to de-risk the technology, deploy it in some of the communities that need it most, and then use the private sector money to help those companies commercialize and scale, right, across the globe. So those are just some examples of how to do so, right? And I can't emphasize enough that this absolutely has to be done in partnership with the local community, whether it's in the product design, whether it's in these community meetings, right? Where these EV chargers are going to go and who's going to be able to access them, what the rates will be for payment, right? All of those things are multifaceted conversations that all of us sort of need to come together around the table to actually implement.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I love that you said that, the communities that are affected, whether that's women, whether that's minorities, people with low socioeconomic status, we need to, I'm going to reiterate it, we need to elevate their voices. So while as we're trying to address climate issues, addressing issues of inequality and inequity also helps us getting to addressing climate issues, because those are the issues that may be at the forefront of the minds of people who are also suffering from more of the climate impact. So I love that you said that.
Right. I think it comes back to that privilege, right? Like, I didn't come from privilege at all, right? And many of us did not, right? But I have extreme amounts of privilege now. I am extremely well educated. I've worked in a lot of jobs that have given me the check marks on my resume so that I can actually go off and do these things, right? And it's thinking about how can I use my privilege, my resources, my knowledge, my networks to actually make a difference. because not everybody can show up to that 7 p.m. community board meeting, right? Because they might be working at the gas station, they might be driving the Uber, right? They might be out trying to earn money for their families. But how can you use your voice to actually represent those folks who cannot come, right? And I think like we as a society, right, cannot forget how we can be impactful and be those voices for others as well.
I love that. And I feel the exact same way. Also did not come from much, grew up not, wasting anything, because that was the mindset of my family, is that, we don't have a lot. And so we make the best with what we have. And that is something I've carried through with me. Now I'm in a much more privileged position, right? I have a great job, and am financially stable and don't really have to think about, resources that are lacking, but I still think about where I've come from, and am using that, and thinking about the communities that I've come from, that may still not have access to enough resources that would help improve their quality of life, and keeping them in my mind as I talk to people at work, because I work primarily with a lot of privileged people who have money, and generally, from not minorities, high socioeconomic status, and making sure that I'm consistently bringing the perspective of the community that I grew up in, which was underserved, and making sure that those voices and those perspectives are heard in these conversations. So I think that is something that everyone can take away on this call, and just thinking about where you are in terms of your privilege, and then just, I think I'm probably gonna ask maybe one or two questions before we wrap up, but shifting now to thinking about trends. I mean, I think there are just gonna be a lot more jobs that are going to be more clearly defined as jobs that are supporting the climate industry. And so what are some other trends that you're foreseeing in this field, in addition to just more investment in these roles, more money set aside by local governments and by cities to activate these projects and these solutions? But are there other trends that we're going to see in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that decarbonization is just a huge trend, right? We have to spend this is a $5 trillion annual market opportunity. So I think about it as, how does government, the private sector, right, which is where the vast majority of this money lies, and startups, right, and entrepreneurs come together to deploy solutions in these communities that need it most. Some of the things that I find really interesting, right, when it comes to the built environment, and sort of these urban infrastructure solutions, are things like new HVAC systems, right? There's only so much that putting a Nest or, some sort of energy management tool that reminds me to turn off my lights is going to do, right? That's a drop in the bucket. But what I actually need to do is I need to change my HVAC system and fully decarbonize it through heat pumps and HVAC and sort of more electrified solutions. It means shifting my hot water boiler and electrifying that. It means that instead of buying a gas-powered stove, I'm buying an induction hot plate, right? Which is much better in terms of the carbon emissions, but it's also frankly much healthier within my environment, right? Because there's tons of methane emissions that happen with some of these appliances that are in our homes, right, that we're only now starting to understand some of the negative consequences of, right? So it's a lot of those individual decisions that you can make, and the trends in the industries that are going to grow sort of when it comes to what is within your home. Then there's the broader what is outside of your home, right? And that infrastructure layer that I was talking about. So, the fact of the matter is that consumption is increasing, right? And we talked a lot about that earlier. But there are a whole host of new circular economy solutions, right? In terms of packaging, in terms of recycling, in terms of waste to energy. Those are all growing by leaps and bounds. There is a significant amount of investment in renewable energy, right? So solar and wind are finally at cost curves that are equivalent to gas, right, and to oil, right, in sort of this oil fueled economy. So it's making investments in those technologies and actually scaling those technologies at this point in time, right? So there's a huge amount of opportunity in project development, in making those panels much more efficient, thinking about the design of the wind turbine, right, and the thickness of the blades and the materials of the blades, recycling all of these materials at the end of their useful life, right? Recycling things like the batteries within our electric vehicles or within our phones, right? There's a whole host of sort of consequences that these new products will create in the supply chains and the materials that are going to be used in these new products and how they can then be reused. There is also a lot of investment in food and agriculture. Again, this is not necessarily my space because I focus primarily on urban innovation, but thinking about regenerative agriculture, right? How we actually grow our food and our own consumption habits around that. Cell-based meat and plant-based meat, right? In my house, we've basically almost more or less stopped eating meat, right? We use Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers, right? If we want a burger, because it's healthier for us, right? So these are all things that are going to continue to grow, right? And it's about thinking more so about creating markets and getting the cost curves and the manufacturing processes and the production processes and the R&D at a place where it can be equivalent to sort of the more traditional products out there. So all of these are areas of all of these are areas of innovation that are continuing to grow and will scale massively in the years to come.
That's awesome. Really amazing to hear, I think, especially for folks on the call looking to pivot. I want to wrap up and just wanted to see if there was any final remarks you have, whether it's related to careers or anything like that you would like to share with the group that maybe we haven't talked about.
Yeah, I mean, you get involved, right? These are the small decisions that you can make at home and then start talking about them, right? An example that I'll give, we had some friends over last night. And we were talking about doing the laundry, and in my home we have these laundry sheets that we use, right? So instead of buying like the Tide laundry detergent, that big bottle of plastic, right, that's like 80% water, we buy these sort of laundry sheets that we put into our washer. And it comes in this small box, right? It's a cardboard box that I can recycle, and it takes a lot less space in my cupboard. I live in New York City. I live in very small quarters because I live in a very sort of high cost, place. And these were just as good, if not better, than my Tide laundry detergent, right? And the fact that I talked about that with my friends who then went out and, bought this stuff when they were on their way home is what creates market demand, right? It's the fact that you yourself are making a conscious decision to change your own habits and sharing that with other people. And I think that's what we talk about when we think about agency and optimism and climate action, right? It's what can you do individually, and then how can you use your collective voice, right, when you're voting and when you're showing up to these community board meetings to actually move the needle on some of these much larger systems changes that are necessary.
I love that. And I also use those laundry sheets, and I've shared it with coworkers and brought some in for them to use. So I agree with you. Like, it's the little conversations. You don't necessarily, you can just start talking to your family members. You can just start talking to whoever is in the next social group you're part of, whether you play sports every weekend and you talk to, the people on the team, or you're talking to coworkers or friends. But just starting those conversations and just being able to discuss what you've learned, a lot of change can happen there. I think just for people who are looking to shift and get involved in more sustainability careers and learn more about that, and want to have questions about certifications, I personally recommend the website sustainablecareerpathways.com and have gotten a lot of helpful information that way. So I'm just going to put that link in the chat. And that's been really helpful just to get a sense of what are all the different jobs out there that touch the climate and sustainability space. What are some courses that are offered and certifications that I can take, things like that. So I think that's a really helpful resource. I don't know, Sonam, if you're familiar with this resource. Yes, but this was really helpful to me as I was starting out. And Sonam, I think if you don't have any final remarks, I just want to thank you for all your time today and for speaking with us and presenting and talking about urban climate innovation. It is a field of a lot of hope and, to your point, abundance and exciting stuff and exciting tech. So I'm really looking forward to the different ways that we can start having more conversations about this. That's it. Thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate all of your questions and for your active engagement in this conversation with Sonam today. So thank you everyone, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.